In this module, we'll talk about Greenhouse Gas Protocol and carbon reporting standards.
The Greenhouse Gas Protocol is a comprehensive global standard framework that can be used to measure and manage greenhouse gas emissions from private and public sector operations. This standard is particularly relevant in assigning responsibility for emissions on a project, providing two approaches for defining organizational boundaries. Under an equity share approach, an agency quantifies its emissions based on its relative shares in the operation. While this is a simple way of allocating shares, project equity is not necessarily proportional to an entity's emissions. Because of this, the U.S. public sector largely uses a control approach, which accounts for 100% of the emissions from operations under a party's control. Control can be defined financially or operationally, but the agency only calculates emissions from activities over which they have a majority stake. Once an entity has determined their responsibilities, they must then decide which emissions to report. Operational emissions are divided into three categories. Scope 1 includes direct greenhouse gas emissions. These emissions come from sources directly owned or controlled by the organization, and reporting is required. For transportation infrastructure, this would include emissions from fleet vehicles owned by the state DOT, such as hauling trucks or ferries. Scope 2 is defined as indirect greenhouse gas emissions due to electricity consumption. These represent emissions from the generation of purchased electricity consumed by an organization and are also required to be included in reports. These types of emissions could be represented by the electrical bill for a job site office. Scope 3 covers other indirect greenhouse gas emissions. This category is best understood as the upstream and downstream emissions of agency activity. Take a pavement construction project, for example. Upstream of this job, there are emissions from material extraction and manufacturing processes. Downstream of the construction, more impacts can be determined. During the use stage, there are emissions from rolling resistance of vehicle traffic on the pavement surface. Once a road has been decommissioned, emissions come from material disposal processes. Upstream and downstream, all these emissions are indirectly tied to the agency that built the road. While Scope 3 is officially defined as optional in the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, this category accounts for a rather significant portion of emissions relative to Scopes 1 and 2 and provides meaningful avenues for carbon reduction to occur. This category is intended to be broad, and it serves as a way for organizations to study their supply chains, both upstream and downstream, for the best opportunities in reducing emissions.